Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe and Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to Edison format and taking a look at a deck that is very reflective of the time period. It's actually Edwin Ortiz's top 32 Flamvell Monarch deck. Flamvells themselves haven't seen as much popularity in the modern iteration of Edison, but for, this is a Yu-Gi-Oh! History channel. We will blend a little bit of modern and a little bit of retro with formats like Edison. But today we're going to really dive into the retro aspect of Edison format. Flamvells was a deck that saw a lot of hype heading into SJC Edison. I vividly remembered the discussion, and the discussion was, can we play Super Nimble Mega Hamster in a format where Flamvell Fire Dog is popular? Because the 1900 attack of Flamvell Fire Dog lines up perfectly with the 1800 defense of Nimble Mega Hamster from the perspective of the Flamvell player, and were we willing to actually play a card like Mega Hamster, which isn't an integral part of our strategy per se, but is definitely a strong card if it makes us vulnerable to Flamvell strategies? Flamvell saw some success at SJC Edison, and then some middling success in the months and years that would follow. Obviously, heading after SJC Edison, there's a big shift in the format. Once things quieted down in the fall, after the limitations to Infernities, X-Sabers, and Frog FTK, Flamvell decks saw some success here or there, but the Flamvell strategy really centers around three cards. Fire Dog and Magician. Fire Dog, a 1900 attack monster. When it destroys something by battle, you can search your deck for a 1400 tuner, allowing you to then go into a level 8 in main phase 2. Stardust, Colossal, Red Dragon, Archfiend, Thought Realer, those types of cards. But then obviously their most powerful card, Rekindling, which revives all of the Flamvells that have 200 or less defense from the graveyard, enabling you to summon 1, 2, 3, technically up to 5 monsters, and then potentially go into a bunch of synchros from that point. Even if that's not enough to deal enough damage to win the game, you could go into multiple Stardust, the Stardust Colossal, really establish a full board. And when we actually look at Edison in and of itself, it's a format with a lot of one-for-one trades. Rekindling is so powerful, it just goes over the top of everything. Where quick draw decks try to utilize the graveyard and the long drawn-out game to play 1, 2, maybe even 3 Pot of Avarices, this deck is instead going to use Rekindling, and as the game progresses longer and more Flamevells hit the graveyard, that just incrementally increases how much card advantage can be generated with a single Rekindling if you're summoning 3, 4 monsters, going into multiple synchros, potentially putting enough damage on board to win the game. So it's really an interesting strategy. Again, not a strategy that saw a ton of success when we go and play Modernize Edison, but definitely to understand the event itself, that specific weekend, it's really important to chronicle because there is a huge discussion point about what type of set monsters you could reliably play in a format where Flamvell Fire Dog was going to be popular. But today we're going to take a look at Edwin Ortiz's top 32 deck list. Edwin is actually the person that knocked out my very close friend Paul Clark in the top 32 of Edison. I vividly remember watching his match live. But we're going to take a look at his exact deck list, take a look at his side deck, maybe a potential tweak to the extra deck that we'll talk about. But without further ado, let's take a deep dive look for the very first time at Flamvell Monarch. All right, first we'll start with 3 copies of Caius. So modern day Edison has definitely turned into a format where many of the top decks try to utilize Caius the best. This was one of the early decks that didn't have a ton of tribute monsters, but definitely still tried to emphasize Caius, right? We see Caius, a couple copies here or there in things like quick draw decks. This deck specifically, though, just fully committed to Caius, trying to get as much value by tributing floaters. And when we use the word floater in earlier Yu-Gi-Oh!, oftentimes we're talking about flip effect monsters that generate advantage, like Gravekeeper's Descendant, Raikou, and then even some others in this deck. So we have 3 copies of Caius. This deck, because it's playing Rekindling, can also very easily put a monster on the field as tribute fodder through a large Rekindling, or honestly, even just a Rekindling for 1. So there's that added synergy in this deck. Then we have 3 copies of Flamvell Fire Dog. So this monster's 1900 attack was really important. Going into the event, one of the big discussion points was how good Super Nimble Mega Hamster actually was. So Super Nimble Mega Hamster has an 1800 defense, tutors usually Raikou out of your deck face down. Great synergy in a deck that's trying to tribute summon for Caius, right? That idea of flipping Raikou, hitting a back row, tributing for Caius, hitting a monster is just picture perfect Yu-Gi-Oh! When it works. However, one of the liabilities, one of the issues that you needed to consider if you played Nimble Mega Hamster was the reality that Flamvell Fire Dog saw some degree of popularity in the weeks leading up to Edison. It was really a huge discussion point. Would you be willing to actually play a deck with Nimble Mega Hamster because Flamvell Fire Dog existed? Because Fire Dog can attack over Mega Hamster. Yes, you get Raikou, but Flamvell Fire Dog tutors out Flamvell Magician. Now, Flamvell Magician's effect is, it never really matters. It has to do with having ally monsters on the field. It just never really happens. It is a 1400 tuner. That is the only thing that matters with Flamvell Magician, but it is what you get to tutor off of Flamvell Fire Dog. So one Flamvell Fire Dog attacking over a Mega Hamster puts a level 4 tuner on the field, and now you have a level 4 or level 4, you can go into Stardust Dragon. Stardust Dragon obviously shuts down Raikou really well. Plus, later on in the game, it refuels Rekindling. I mean, Rekindling can go off for 2, 3, 4 monsters. It's obviously absolutely game-breaking. It gave this deck a unique tool that not a lot of other decks had, right? Other decks tried to use things like Pot of Avarice to take advantage of the long game. This deck instead used the graveyard as a resource with cards like Rekindling. So the ability not only to fuel future Rekindlings, but put instantly a level 8 on the board is actually pretty potent. This deck's going to try and utilize level 8s probably more than any deck in the format, particularly if we actually go back and play actual Edison as opposed to some of the more modernized versions of the format. But heading into the event, this was really one of the scary cards, Flamvell Fire Dog. And always keeping in the back of your mind, am I willing to put the Sangan on the field? Am I willing to put a Sure on the field if I don't have Collude, right? You have to always worry about Flamvell Fire Dog and make sure you have trap cards, make sure you have some type of resistance or not even put a monster on the field in the first place, because this card can be absolutely game-breaking, because not only does it result in a level 8 Synchro, it fuels future Rekindlings, and both of those are ways you're going to very quickly lose to this deck. So those are, in my opinion, some of the more important monsters in the deck. The rest are some of the floaters to combine with Caius and just nickel and dime the opponent. We have, of course, 3 copies of Raikou. Raikou is incredibly popular during the Edison year, or during the Edison event. We saw 3 copies in things like Quick Draw. We obviously see 3 copies in this deck. Obviously going to be seen in other Lightshorn strategies, but heading into the event, Raikou was really one of the more important cards. It also lines up really well with Gravekeeper's Spy, with the newly released Gravekeeper's Descendant. So these flip effect monsters, we see them in things like Cat Synchro, Caliber Cat, obviously this deck. The idea here is that they are both going to serve as floaters that can play to the board, right? Both of these ultimately result in destruction on the field. You technically need to be able to get Descendant on your own turn in order to actually destroy a card with Spy. And if they attack into Spy, if they don't have a second monster, you can't just put Descendant on the field and then go to your turn and use Descendant's effect. That would very often happen, right? If you're sitting there with Deep Prison and Bottomless End and a bunch of cards in your hand that don't react well to that field, you can reliably just summon the Descendant off of the Spy and then get back to your turn. Otherwise, the perfect world is you flip the Spy, get out the Ascendant, priority off the Spy, pop a card on the field, maybe then tribute for Caius. Or this actually remains at a level 4 non-tuner. Magician is the worst draw in the deck, but very oftentimes you can combine Magician with the Gravekeeper package in order to go into level 8 synchros. And then the same is somewhat true with Raikou, right? You flip Raikou, pop a card, summon Magician. There are ways of utilizing what is otherwise not a great draw. So this 6 flip effects, plus I'll even consider Mega Hamster as part of this, giving us 7 really great flip effects to combine with Caius when we draw it or Magician when we draw it, and really utilize that field presence, something that this deck really got to use well. Past that, we have some sort of utility cards. So we have a Chaos Sorcerer. This deck has a reasonable amount of light and dark, so you actually just see a giant collection of them here. In terms of other light monsters, we have a Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon also gives us a little bit of play against the Machina-based decks and the Gadget-based decks, or the Machina-based decks, heading into the event, which were relatively popular. It also can counteract opponent Cyber Dragons, which you would occasionally see in main decks. It also is another light monster, giving us 4 light monsters, not considering the extra deck, which we're obviously going to have a few more there. We have a copy of Gale. Gale was just a very common tuner that a lot of decks played even if they weren't running Blackwings, right? You can combine it with with Mind Control and Brain Control to actually special summon it. That does technically happen against Blackwing matchups. It doesn't happen all the time, but otherwise you can just normal summon it in combination with a Spy to go into Arcanite or Black Rose. That's really powerful. You can normal summon it in combination with Cyber Dragon, right? You can go special normal. This actually ends up with a level 8. Maybe with modern perspective, utilizing 2 monsters like that to go into a level 8 might be a little underwhelming, but it was something that you'd see relatively common back in the day. Obviously, its effect is pretty good. Having a monster attacking over it, it gives you outs to Stardust, gives you outs to a lot of cards in the format. So 1 copy of Gale, which was very common, right? Otherwise, in terms of actual tuners, we just have the Magicians. Having at least 1 level 3 in the deck gives us more utility to access different types of synchro monsters. And then we have 1 copy of Gores, which wasn't exactly a full staple per se. A lot of decks like Gadgets might not necessarily play it, but this deck, it is sort of your traditional style of deck. We're going to see Gores in a lot of decks like this. But that is our monster lineup. Heading now into the spells. So we have a lot of flip effects, right? We have the 3 Spies, 3 Raikous, and we have the Super Nimble Mega Hamster. So in order to combine both as a defensive card, as a card to set when we go into Stardust, which we go into a lot because we're going into a lot of level 8s, we're going to have 3 copies of Book of Moon. Book of Moon is one of my favorite cards in this format. It's just such a versatile card.
As I just mentioned, you can reset flip effects, but you also obviously can utilize it to set a tuner face down that your opponent thinks they're going to be able to use. You can use it offensively, defensively, use it to book an attack over a monster with a card like Flamvell Fire Dog that obviously can come up a lot. Being able to book a moon a monster whose attack might be over 19, but whose defense might be, for example, a Monarch like Caius. So having 3 Book of Moons really does a great job allowing you to play that defensive sort of build a castle mode when you get into Stardust, but then also allow you to actually get into that game state by attacking over monsters with Flamvell Magician. Then we have, really, to me, the reason to play this deck. As fine of a card as Flamvell Fire Dog is, you do have to play 3 relatively bad cards, 3 Magicians. Yes, you have Brain Control, Mind Control, you have some of the synergies like I alluded to with Spy and going into level 8s, but honestly, you wouldn't just play a 1400 tuner for the sake of it being a tuner. Flamvell Fire Dog is probably not enough to play this deck. It's really the Rekindling which is the reason to play this deck. So for those of you who don't know what this card does, it allows you to special summon all of the, in this case, Flamvell monsters from your graveyard, right? Monsters that have 200 or less defense, which is the case with all of the Flamvell cards. You have Flamvell Magician with 200 defense and Flamvell Fire Dog. And this is honestly the closest iteration of Soul Charge, probably up to this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, minus cards like maybe Defusion, but that comes from the Banish pile. So basically in the late game, you could be sitting there back and forth, nickel and diming, right? This format is very tempo-based, it's very card advantage-based, but it kind of takes a lot, right? You have to flip Raikou at the perfect time, Dust Tornado trades back and forth, Deprison, a lot of one-for-one trades, and then you really have to work for those +1s. Well, now all of a sudden you play Rekindling and you summon 4 monsters back. And if your opponent doesn't have Bottomless to get rid of the Magician, or rather to get rid of the Fire Dogs, or a card like Torrential Tribute to get rid of everything, Rekindling can just be absolutely game-breaking because then you go into 2 Synchro Monsters, even just 1 Synchro Monster. So Rekindling is just an absolutely game-breaking effect. It is unmatched in this format, I think. I think if you're going to at least play Edison in Edison format, this card is arguably one of the most powerful cards. Certainly in the modern day, we see cards like Super Rejuvenation see popularity, which might go over the top of Rekindling, but that card was only played in OTK-based strategies at actual Edison. If we actually took a time machine back to 2010, arguably the most powerful card when it resolves to its full potential was Rekindling, and this was the only deck that got to play it, which was not the case with cards like Pot Avarice, which you see sprinkled through a lot of decks, right? With 3 Pot Avarices, certainly the Quick Draw deck and other strategies, Lightsworn-based strategies, saw Pot of Avarice because it is such a powerful card. Rekindling is that card advantage, that +1, maybe +2, +3, that also ends up into Synchro Monsters. So Rekindling, absolutely amazing. Combines really well, right? If you just have Magician in the grave, you can just bring it back and combine with a Spy to go into a Synchro. You don't necessarily just have to resolve this into only Flamevells going into Synchro Monsters. Your deck has a lot of field presence through Spies, potentially through Raikous, potentially through Super Nimble Mega Hamster. So you can absolutely utilize this not just to bring out Dog and Magician to go into level 8. You can just bring back Magician. You can just bring back multiple Magicians, right? It is just an amazing card. Gives this deck a ton of flexibility and gives it that inevitability, right? If you go long with Flamevell decks, you do have to worry that if the game goes too long, they're going to draw into 1, 2, 3 copies of Rekindling. And yeah, you might be able to react to 1, maybe 2, but eventually it's just going to break the dam and you're eventually going to lose to Rekindling. So it is the reason to play this deck, in my opinion. Past that, we have some pseudo staples, MST Heavy Storm, and obviously Brain and Mind Control. We definitely want to have ways of combining that sort of poor draw with Magician with something, not necessarily just having to rely on Spy resolving. And both of these are obviously fantastic. They combine really well with Rekindling, right? In theory, you either draw Magician or you get a Fire Dog resolution. So usually you always have access to a Magician in the grave, which makes Rekindling fantastic, which makes these fantastic. Brain is just amazing with cards like Caius too. We also, as I mentioned, have Gale. So we have 4 tuners to combine with those. So that gives us our spells. And then for monsters, right? So this deck can go into Stardust really easily. And as a result, we do want to have a decent amount of trap cards so that when we summon Stardust, we can set a bunch of traps, kind of play that style. So we have a couple of copies of Bottomless, which we see in basically every single traditional style of deck, not a strategy that's really polarized, like Frog Monarchs, for example, that might not play any traps. In your sort of traditional style of decks, Quick Draw Gadgets, you can see Bottomless on a lot of them. Same with Deep Prison, right? We see this in a lot of decks, Gladiator Beasts. Then we have some one-ofs. We have Mirror Force, which combines kind of as a 3rd copy of Deep Prison, Solemn Judgment, Royal Oppression, Dust Tornado, and Trap Dust Shoot. So this is Edwin Ortiz's deck list, as I alluded to. In terms of the actual lineup, we see a little bit of sort of that old Teledad where you're going to go into a Stardust with Oppression, Solemn Judgment kind of back it up. Dust Tornado just kind of fits the role of a lot of cards this format. There's those 1-for-1 trades. Totally reasonable card. Trap Dust Shoot, to me, is one of the best cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, so I'm totally fine main decking that. just a very robust trap lineup. I also consider Book of Moon, so when you're looking at a lineup like this, to consider just how big of a board that you can establish with Stardust. But that is our main deck. First, we'll go into the extra deck. So, of course, we're playing Chimera Tech because we have access to Cyber. You could consider bumping this up to 2 because we do have an extra Cyber in the side deck, but Edwin elected just to play 1. I think that's probably all you need, but it is something to consider. You don't have Avarice, so you don't get to double Chimera Tech. So we'll start first with the level 5. So we have, of course, Cataster and Magical Android. You do play Raikou, and then you do play Gale, so there are ways of going in this, and if you play Mind, Brain Control type cards, you do want to have access to these. You're not going into them all the time, but we're not at a point where there's just an infinite number of playable synchros, so having access to level 5s when it might not necessarily seem like you're always going to go into them is valuable. For level 6s, we have the Flamvell, or Quasis, I believe is how you pronounce this. It's basically just a monster with piercing. I know it is technically a Flamvell monster in and of itself, but it in and of itself doesn't actually combine with anything like Rekindling. It actually has too much defense to be revived off of Rekindling, so it in and of itself is just a piercer. I know it's a Flamvell monster, but it doesn't really synergize in any unique and special way. And it doesn't require any special attributes. It's just 2 monsters, right? Any deck could have played this. We have Bryanak, and of course we have Goyo Guardian, the other great level 6s. For level 7s, which we get to go into with Gale or through some combination of Brain Control and Mind Control, we have Arcanite Magician. Spy is obviously a spellcaster, so there's always been synergy between level 3 Tuner and a Spy or a Descendant even to go into Arcanite Magician. We have Armor Master because we do play Gale. And then this deck, we also have Black Rose Dragon, of course. This deck, as I alluded to, is primarily going into level 8s. So Edwin technically played 2 copies of Colossal Fighter, which is totally reasonable. I think most people who play modern Edison play with Dark End Dragon. I honestly don't think you should. There were not many Dark End Dragons in the world, and they were relatively expensive. They're about $1,000 for a Dark End heading into Edison. They dropped down to about $800 after Edison, so it kind of depends on the type of player you are. If you're the type of player who plays modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And has, a Starlight Apollousa in your deck, yeah, I guess you probably would have had Dark End if you're willing to pay that kind of money for a card. So I feel like people play Dark End Dragon a little bit too much when they go back and play Edison. There were some events, but there weren't a ton of events leading into Edison where this card was actually released. There were a bunch of them released after Edison, right? More than just the top 4 got Dark End Dragons after Edison, so the market was a little bit more saturated heading into the summer. However, heading into actual Edison, this card wasn't that easy to obtain, but a lot of people go back and just put this in their deck regardless of that. So you can maybe put the double Colossal like Edwin did, or if you want to kind of diversify the extra deck, you could put a Dark End Dragon. Then, of course, we have a Thought Ruler, Red Dragon Archfiend, and then I think double Stardust is really important in a deck that goes into level 8 so much. Being able to establish Stardust on a bunch of back rows is relatively good, right? There's a format with Kaya, so it's not an instant game. People definitely have outs to it, but it is definitely something that comes up a lot. And I like being able to go into multiple Stardust when we're playing cards like Rekindling. So that is the extra deck. And you can mess around if you want to put in the double Colossal, maybe over the Stardust Dragon. So Edison's kind of an interesting format, as I've alluded to. This particular profile is more geared towards actual Edison in 2010. You could consider maybe revamping this deck for modern day. If you wanted to do that, obviously you'd have to change some things around. People still play Quick Draw. People, more so back in the day, played Royal Magical Library Dragon combo decks. The Dragon combo decks have kind of evolved into like Sky Scourge and Illyris-based decks, as I've talked about. So you definitely need to consider those combo decks. There's still Cat decks. Obviously, Blackwings is super popular. Vayu Turbo decks are pretty popular. A few different Frog iterations, Frog Control, Frog Monarch. Obviously, Mackin is still a real deck. It was back then. Some type of Absolute Zero, Diva-based, D-Hero-based strategies obviously see some play. Zombies is incredibly popular in Modern. Edison, X-Sabers had yet to really see their power cards like Dark Soul, but you could still see them. I love GBs. I've talked about them. They're Lightsworn strategies. Gravekeepers had yet to get Recruiter, but they were sort of on the fringes. Of course, Elemental Hero strategies. I guess technically the Mirror Match is one, too, that I don't have reflected here, so I'll throw Magician. Here are some of the decks that you could play. Edison has kind of gone through such an evolution, it's hard to keep track. But if you actually went to the event in and of itself, this is a pretty good encapsulation of what you can anticipate playing. This was Edwin's deck, so this, again, is geared towards actual 2010. I would still consider having the second Cyber somewhere. Even maybe taking the Cyber out of the main deck and putting it in the side deck. I definitely want 2 Cyber Dragons no matter what, because it's a good card going second. It's good against GBs. Obviously, it's amazing against machine decks, so having the second Cyber is pretty good. Edwin elected to play 2 copies of Banisher the Radiance, which can be really good going first against some of the strategies like Frog Monarchs. Certainly against Frog Control decks, right? It has some utility there against maybe even the Destiny or the the Dragon draw deck, this card can be incredible. It's also pretty good against plants. Cards like Pot of Avarice, definitely seeing this on the first turn and having to utilize some resources that might end up banishing some of your monsters can be pretty frustrating. You have outs like Raikou, it's not like it's a game over, but it can be really annoying. I remember I actually lost to a macro-based strategy with plants at Edison. And, game one, they play macro early on, and yes, you have Raikous in your deck, but it's just really difficult to fight through everything. So double Banisher, double Jujutsu Master lines up really well. Historically against gadgets, Gearframe has 1800 attack, so that lines up pretty well there. And then historically against Gladiator Beast, it's really good. Yes, War Chariot can out this. However, that doesn't necessarily always happen. And if you have cards like Dust Tornado, you can actually hit War Chariot and maybe get this to resolve, and then your opponent's kind of in a tough spot. So double Jujutsu Master, it just kind of walls there, and if they don't have War Chariot because they haven't drawn it and they haven't been able to resolve Samurai, it can just buy you time, right? There's not a good way of dealing with this. Yeah, they eventually can Murmelio it. There are outs to it if Test Tiger, but it's just an inconvenience, and you don't traditionally get to set a lot against Gladiator Beasts and feel at least somewhat protected, so Jujutsu Master lines up really well against that matchup. Couple copies of Consecrated Light. This is obviously fantastic against Blackwing-based strategies. It can be incredibly frustrating to play against. We have some System Downs, which is even more Side Dictate for the machine-based strategy. So we have 4, if you consider the Cyber in the main deck, just absolute blowouts against that deck. Edwin elected to play a copy of Lightning Vortex. I don't think I would consider siding this anymore. This might be considered a out to boards with a bunch of tokens from Dandelion that maybe allow you to set up an OTK. That would probably be the most reasonable reason to run this card. Then we have a couple copies of Pulling the Rug, obviously a fantastic card in the format. Lines up really well against frog-based strategies, against monarch-based strategies, against gadgets. It can be okay. I think it's overrated. I know it hits Gearframe and the gadgets, which on the surface is good, but if the game goes long, hitting a gadget mid-game isn't really that great because they've already generated a bunch of advantage. A couple late imprisoning mirrors, because obviously Lightsworns can be a really difficult matchup. If you didn't notice, there was no Torrential in the main deck. I think Torrential is a good card when you're playing against Dandelion tokens. I think Edwin's logic at the time was this is a deck that's really playing to the field. I don't necessarily want Torrential in my deck. I don't want to Torrential a board of Stardust Dragons. I'd rather have a card like Deep Prison or Mirror Force, which I can understand, but maybe against the quick draw based strategies or some of the other strategies that might be a little bit more aggressive, you want it, right? It's obviously great to have against something like GBs. So I can understand not putting it in the main deck. I personally, philosophically, have always found that logic to be a little bit flawed, right? People didn't like to play Torrential in things like Dino-Rabbit or even decks like Teledad because they think you're always going to play to the field. But I think Torrential, because games go very long, it's just one of those cards that you can utilize really well, right? You can flip Spy, chain Torrential, Spy resolves, monster comes out, flip Nimble Mega Hamster, flip Torrential, Torrential resolves first, Raikou ends up on a blank field. I think there are cool plays you can do with Torrential, and it's a card that is just such a unique card. But anyway, that is our deep dive look at Flamvell Monarchs. That's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.